The new year has begun the same way the last one ended, with thousands upon thousands of men dying, and the war seems only to expand. As the year changed from old to new, we saw an entire army destroyed, many of its soldiers freezing to death in the mountains of the Caucasus, and now, weeks later, we see something else. That no matter how the war changes, many military leaders were unwilling or incapable of learning from the mistakes of others and just made the same ones again and again. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. When we left off, the Germans were successful in East Africa, but would in future resort to guerrilla warfare. The British were successful in the Middle East, but were bombed by Zeppelin at home. The French had some minor successes on the Western Front, and the Turks were defeated again by the Russians, who had also made an advance in northwest Poland. Geography cannot help but play a large part in war. You use different troops and maneuvers on a large flat plain than you do in a dense forest. I'd like to start off today by looking at some European geography for a minute, specifically the Carpathian Mountains. Now, we're looking at a barrier about 100 kilometers wide with a median elevation of over 1,000 meters. Now that's a formidable natural barrier for any army to get through, and even in the main passes of the Carpathians, there were only a handful of poorly constructed roads and railway lines. It's always cold and damp up there, but once the snows come in November, they remain there till the spring, with occasional sudden rises in temperature that cause large-scale flooding. Mountain warfare has a whole series of other unique difficulties. Troops obviously have to be specially trained and equipped. Maintaining supply lines and maneuvering can be real problems. Artillery often has to be left behind since it's so heavy and the ground uneven. Stuff like that. Stuff that should deter large-scale military operations. In winter. Well, that setting was where this week, on January 23rd, 1915, the Austro-Hungarian army launched an offensive against the Russians. This was the brainchild of Austro-Hungarian Army Chief of Staff Konrad von Hötzendorf, who believed that Austria now needed a major victory over Russia to show her strength, so that neutral countries like Italy and Romania wouldn't enter the war against her. This makes sense, I suppose, because the Imperial Army had suffered some seriously embarrassing defeats so far during the war, and the second invasion of Serbia in November and December had ended in humiliation. So Austria-Hungary didn't have a whole lot of military prestige left. Also, a whole Austrian army, well over 100,000 strong, was surrounded and under siege in Przemysl, behind Russian lines, and all of the Habsburg gang thought that losing that army might in fact lose the whole war. So the offensive had breaking the siege as a main objective. The basic plans called for the Third Army to attack along a front of over 150 kilometers in the northern Carpathians, while simultaneously the newly created Southern Army, which included 3 German divisions, would attack the Russians' extreme left flank. The element of surprise was supposed to be a big factor in a quick success. I think we can also all agree that luck was going to have to be a big factor too. The combined offensive forces were about 175,000 men, and right away they proved incapable of accomplishing their initial tasks, which were to take and secure the communications and railroads around the towns Liszko, Sanok, and Medzyleborce, and I'm sorry if I'm mangling those names. Now, that's not to say there wasn't some progress and positive results, because there were initially, as the Austrians advanced against a numerically inferior foe, and by the 26th, the Third Army's actual front extended for over 100 kilometers from the Dukla to Usok passes. Konrad's army managed to capture the Usok Pass that day, which had been held by the Russians since the beginning of the year. But that same day, the Russians began to launch massive counterattacks, and as the week ended, a sudden and severe change in the weather began to seriously mess with the Austrian plans. But plans, especially war plans, have a way of going wrong, and this was also the case this week in the North Sea. Last month, German ships under the command of Franz von Hipper had bombarded the British coast and successfully escaped back to Germany. Since that day, when the first civilians were killed in Britain by enemy forces for over 200 years, Britain had been clamoring for revenge against the German Navy, and on January 24th, they got it. Von Hipper set out to attack the British fleet at Dogger Bank, whom he suspected of gathering intelligence on German fleet movement. But the British had intercepted and decoded German radio traffic about the raid, and Vice Admiral David Beatty led his battlecruiser squadron out to trap von Hipper. The Germans were outnumbered and surprised, though they managed to make it back to port with only the loss of the armored cruiser Blücher. Coincidentally, the last armored cruiser the Germans built. See, there was a signaling mix-up, and the British fleet broke off pursuit of the German fleet to sink Blücher. So the opportunity to do huge damage to the German Navy was lost. But with only 15 British sailors lost against nearly 1,000 Germans, this was a big morale boost for the British, and the Kaiser was so angry that Admiral Friedrich von Ingenohl, commander of the German High Seas Fleet, was replaced by Admiral Hugo von Pohl. Here's something else. The Germans realized that the British appearance at dawn at Dogger Bank was suspiciously coincidental, but they did not believe that their radio codes had been cracked, and instead thought that an enemy agent must have provided intelligence about their plans. The Germans were fighting on land as well this week in a series of battles with the French on the Western Front. At the beginning of the week, there was heavy fighting in Alsace and the Argonne, but it was indecisive. The Germans were repulsed at Ypres the 25th, and the French lost ground at Craonne the same day. On the 27th, the French were also initially losing ground in the Argonne, but pushing forward in the Vosges. And at the end of the week, on the 29th, yet another German attempt to cross the Ain River was foiled. One thing that I haven't had a chance to mention that I'll throw in here, which was a big improvement for the French this winter and spring, was the issuance of new uniforms. The new light blue uniforms were far less visible on the battlefield. Any little advantage, you know? Here's also a little anecdote from this week in the West about a character who would play a larger part in a different world war. On January 29th, during the fighting in the Argonne, a German lieutenant named Erwin Rommel led his platoon out to capture some French blockhouses. He crawled through the French wire and shouted for his men to follow, but they didn't. So he crawled back and told the commander of the leading platoon, quote, "Obey my orders instantly, or I shoot you," end quote. Then the whole company followed him out, and they took the blockhouses. For this action, Rommel won the Iron Cross First Class, and it soon became a saying in his regiment, "Where Rommel is, there is the front." The fronts in the West were pretty easy to spot without Rommel, though. You just had to look for the endless lines of trenches. There was another region, though, whose fronts were not nearly so obvious, that in the Middle East and the Caucasus. By this time, the Ottoman Third Army, destroyed at Sarıkamış, numbered fewer than 13,000 effective soldiers and maybe 20,000 total, but there was still plenty of action going on in other parts of the Ottoman Empire. On January 23rd, 2 Ottoman divisions were defeated at Korsan. A few days later, Ottoman assaults were renewed, but on January 27th, the Russians took Gornes and actually captured the Turkish staff. Things were still looking pretty grim for the Turks. And here are a few notes of interest from around the world. The French took Bertoua in Cameroon this week. They also decided on the 26th to participate with the British in an attack on the Dardanelles that was still in the planning stages. On the 27th, Britain loaned £5 million to Romania. And this week, Britain offers Greece concessions in Asia Minor if Greece will help out in Serbia. A few days later, the Greek government says no. And that was this week. The Austrians, Germans, and Russians clashing in the Carpathians. The Russians still beating the Turks further south. The German fleet turning tail and running home in the north. And the French and Germans banging heads again on the Western Front. Another winter assault in the mountains. That's what we're seeing on the Eastern Front. Had Conrad not paid attention to what just happened to the Turks in their mountain assault? Or did he think the situation was so desperate that it didn't matter? It certainly seemed that neither he nor many of the other leaders were learning from others' mistakes. The Turks failed to make coordinated attacks and lost again and again. The British Navy kept letting the Germans get away, even though they cracked their radio codes and knew where they were going to go. And it is painfully obvious what the result of not learning from mistakes is in modern war. It's tens of thousands of dead soldiers, many of whose loss of life was completely avoidable if only their leaders had been paying attention. This was not the first time that Konrad von Hötzendorf had led the Austro-Hungarian army into disaster. Check out our episode about the Battle of Galicia right here, where Hötzendorf's plans failed dramatically. Don't forget to subscribe if you like our channel, and if you're thirsty for more facts about World War I, follow us on Twitter. See you next week.